So, Mr. Chairman, I guess to begin with, we'll kind of go back into history, into the prior century, and talk about some things that kind of happened there that then led to the origins of what's now known as the Entitlement Share program. In the late 80s and the early 90s, there were two reductions in the business equipment tax that were reimbursed.
Could you identify yourself for the record and everything?
Oh, yeah. Excuse me, Bob Story, Montana Taxpayers Association. Anyway, the business equipment tax used to be at, the tax rate on business equipment used to be at 12%, and it was reduced from 12 to 9%, and then subsequently was reduced from 9 to 6%. Both of those times, the state reimbursed local government for a decision that the legislature made to reduce revenue to all entities that depended on property taxes. But both of those programs, both those reimbursement programs, had a phase out on them. They phased out over 10 years. The thinking being that as you reduce those tax rates, you generated more incentive to put in place that kind of equipment, and consequently the tax base would regrow. And to some extent that happened. I think if you look at the numbers in those times that happened, but they did phase out. Well, in 1999 there were significant property tax changes made, and those are on the second slide. I don't know if who's running the equipment here, but so in 1999 there were a lot of changes made in the property tax system. The electrical generation plants were reduced from 12 to 6%. The telecom properties were reduced the same. Business equipment was reduced from 6 to 3% with a trigger that would have eliminated it if the trigger had been hit. And livestock was phased out from ad valorem or property taxes. And all of those then created a pretty large reimbursement to local governments, the cities, counties, and schools, and all the sub groups that you heard about before. It amounted to about $76 million per year in that deal. The concern was among some of us, and especially amongst the folks here, was what happens if the state decides to phase that out? Because there was talk about doing that, and you know, then you eventually have to shift those costs onto the remaining tax base, and we didn't want that to happen. And then the other issue that is on the bottom of the number 2 on your first slide was really, it created the opportunity to go back through and look at some ways to simplify the revenue flows between state and local governments, because they were significant. And so an interim committee was put together to deal with that, and it was kind of a unique interim committee, and I think if Susan and Harold would like to talk about that interim committee, I think now would be the time to do that.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Susan Nicosia. I'm currently the city manager of the city of Columbia Falls. And in 1999, when the legislature created the Local Government Funding and Structure Committee, I had the honor and privilege of being appointed as a city representative to that committee. That committee was unique. Oh, at that time I was a city council member. So the committee was unique because we were made up of course, legislators, but also local government representatives. We had 2 representatives for cities, 2 for counties, and maybe three for counties. There's a lot of moving parts at counties. It was also the Department of Revenue Director, Mary Bryson, served on our committee, and the committee had been assigned to the Tax Policy and Research Division of Department of Revenue. We met for 18 months crafting legislation. It was a significant working committee. It might not look like it, but we simplified Title 7 and 15, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of that throughout the rest of the presentation. But we met for 2 days a month for those 18 months in crafting our legislation and what became known as the big bill and some smaller bills. But throughout that process, the committee was critical. We developed a very strong working relationship, and thanks to this legislative session, this local government committee was established. Maybe in the future we can go back to a similar committee where local government representatives are at the table with you. But the creation of that committee at that time and what we did created this handshake. It created a very strong working relationship. And one of the recommendations of the final report was to have a standing local government committee, because what we saw in working together with then Representative Story, and at that time Harold was a county commissioner from Stillwater County, we knew coming together, this program that we put together and what we had achieved created a partnership and an educational process so that we could all work together. Local governments are controlled by those titles, by legislation. We don't have very much flexibility in what we do. And so creating this and to have this forum to have the education and to be able to work together is critical. And hopefully that's what I see in this committee. So, you know, I can't thank the legislature enough for creating this committee. We've asked for it in the past. It was finally passed this time. I, of course, have to say thank you to Senator Dee Brown for carrying that bill. She's heard from me for many years about the importance of the local government committee because of what we achieved with the 1999 committee. We worked hard. It was brutal. When to say that there is blood, sweat, and tears on that legislation and everything that we went through, but the state entitlement program was the core of what we created at that time, as well as we've already discussed 1510-420, the mill levy calculation, and then doing some of that simplifying. But we couldn't have done it without that makeup, without the 18 months of hard work. And those first couple of meetings, we didn't really know what to expect from one another, but we literally rolled up our sleeves and worked hard. We had code books out. We had a binder from every meeting that was about 6 inches thick and reflected a lot of work. And then the ultimate legislation was the outcome of everything we had done. But critical to that was the formation of this local government committee so that we could work together and continue that progress, because when there's legislation like the 1999 sweeping tax reform, yes, it was sweeping, but the effect was there's a trickle-down effect. We knew that we would lose, and the legislature knew that too. They recognized that and said, let's form a committee. We need to figure out how to lessen the impact, or how do we do this? Cities and counties are dependent upon property tax revenues. We don't have the three-legged stool that they talk about in Economics 101. We don't have property taxes and income tax and natural resource tax. We don't have a balanced approach. We rely very heavily by design, by statute, on property tax revenues. So to have this committee to be able to continue that work, that handshake, that partnership that we created, so that there's in-depth study when there's legislation that impacts local governments or local government funding, it can't be understated how important it is. And I am grateful that this committee was created so that we can continue these discussions into the future and to look at this, because without that committee, those 1999, that effect, and yes, when there's a $76 million cut to the property taxes, the legislative branch did recognize that there's an impact, and how are we going to offset that? How do we work together? Hence our committee, and then ultimately the state entitlement came about as how do we fix this, or how do we work together? As an example, for the city of Columbia Falls, when those provisions went into place to reduce the tax, our city lost 14.5% of its tax base. It was almost $900 a mill, which at the time it was less than $5,000 a mill. So it took unprecedented growth in our community, and 6 years later to get back to that same, it was about $4,800 a mill, to get back to there. But yet, and I think Senator McDonald mentioned earlier about growth. So we had more impacts, and about 23% higher population with the same money that we had before this went into effect. So without that entitlement program and bundling this together, it would have been severe. The entitlement program for this year, our general fund budget is about 2.9 million. Our budgets are similar to what you folks look at, just on a much smaller scale, but the entitlement program funds 24% of that. Our share is $702,000. In comparison, the tax revenue's just under 1.2 million. It funds about 40% of that. So the entitlement program and what we did, and I know there's other slides, but by bundling that revenue together and sending it back out on a quarterly basis is critical to local governments. And I know we'll talk about the revenues that went into the Pale, but it's very important and central to what we do now at the city and county level.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Harold Blatty, B-L-A-T-T-I-E, Executive Director of the Montana Association of Counties. Just a couple more points about the committee. The committee was actually created in Senate Bill 184 in 1999, and in that legislation, the bill had a stated vision statement that I think is just incredibly important. We are dedicated to a partnership among state, county, city, and school districts that is based on mutual trust and respect for local authority. And we think that's a fair thing. It's a fair thing to have mutual respect amongst all of the parties. The primary committee goals were to simplify billing, collection, accounting, distribution, and reporting of revenue. Very important, de-earmark things. For counties, we used to have specific fund limits. Like the road fund was limited to 18 or 20 mills depending upon the county, class of the county. Welfare was limited to 9 mills. District court was 9 mills. Just very specific limits. And what the legislature said, we've got 15, 10, 412. Let's rewrite it to 15, 10, 420, and we'll put an overall limit in there. And local government, we're going to get out of your face and quit telling you how to run your money. This is what your overall property tax limit is. We're not going to tell you how to spend it. You can decide that. You're in a much better position to decide where your needs are, because one of the problems that we had was different needs in different counties. Cascade County was one in particular. Their district court and welfare costs were just staggering, and the revenues that was allowed, the number of mills that was allowed, wasn't adequate to fund those needs. Welfare, there, I don't remember the number, I apologize, but there were a number of counties that the state had just simply assumed the responsibility for welfare, and the counties levied the 9 mills, the maximum they were allowed, sent the money to the state, and the state assumed the administration of public assistance programs. That they just didn't have any place else to get the money, and it certainly was inadequate. So the de-earmarking and eliminating the specific by fund mill levy limits was a very important part for counties. And to create a rational, dependable, and stable funding structure for cities and counties. And as a part of the entitlement share, that growth factor, it was intended that local governments would have a share of the state revenues. That was part of the plan all along. And while we've tinkered with the formula, majorly in 2009, I believe it was, or 11, that the formula that was in use then really wasn't accurately reflective of the state revenues, and so the formula for the growth was changed to be more closely tied to state revenue growth. And So you saw legislation in the last session that reduced that growth amount. And one of the things I'll just anecdotally say, where it's based upon a 3-year average, when state revenues are going down, the growth factor for local governments is going to appear to be high. But when it goes the other direction, when the state revenues start increasing or increasing at a higher rate, the growth factor would lag behind there too. But we willingly participated in the change this session to reduce that growth rate once the bill was amended to allow the underlying formula to go on. So when we come out of the 2-year period, then we'll be where we should. So, but I think it's really important that the work of the committee, and has indicated, the entitlement share came from that. The property tax limit was rewritten. The budget and accounting laws were rewritten. De-earmarking was accomplished. And now this committee has been created. 2 disappointments, 2 failures. The committee also proposed a local option sales tax, and as we all well know, that didn't fly very far. And we also proposed a realty transfer tax, and we know that isn't going to happen now that we have it in our Constitution that we can't have one. So we'll get into more into the actual revenue exchanges and what went on there, but having actual local government, the stakeholders at the table as a part of the committee was, as Susan has indicated, I think was really important to the outcome of what came from the committee.
Thank you. And I think that's a takeaway for future use. When you start doing anything major with local governments or schools, you ought to bring those folks in. You know, I mean, you as legislators, when I was a legislator, we have our own areas of expertise, but it isn't that broad. And so, you know, to get things to work right, you need to start ahead, work with people, and try to put together a plan that is acceptable. You know, you can force a lot of things downhill from the legislature, but many times they don't work very well, and then you have to go back and redo it. But to get back to the point at hand, so we had this opportunity, and through some leadership from various groups and various people, we took it and we ran with it, and we developed what was just explained by both Susan and Harold. So the details of it are really fairly simple. I don't know if Harold brings his handouts, he probably has a couple of the charts that shows how the money used to flow, but I didn't put those on here because they wouldn't translate well to even a picture that size. But so we did 2 things. We created reimbursements that basically, if we took $1 out of your taxing jurisdiction because of those previous tax reductions, you got it back. And if it creates some issues in school funding that are still being addressed in the last legislature. The last couple legislatures and the special session are rolling up block grants. You know, to put money back in schools through the funding formula, you couldn't put it back where you took it out of. You were basically taking someone's money in one school district and giving it to somebody else if you tried to put the school reimbursements back through the funding formula. So we did block grants. Those survived for quite a period of time. They're pretty much phased out now, or going to be gone soon. And that system will adapt to it, but it doesn't work that way with local government. So if you lost money because you had a lot of electrical generation, you got a pretty big entitlement share reimbursement for it. If you had a lot of business equipment, you know, oil refineries are all business equipment. So if you're sitting in Yellowstone County with 3 oil refineries, you got a lot of reimbursement. That money stayed in there, and so that was all probably half of the program. I don't have the real numbers, but that's what the reimbursement side was. The other side was the simplification side, and that was a lot more work to get worked out. But basically what the state was doing, the state had always collected a lot of revenue that they sent to the counties, gaming money, alcohol taxes, financial institutions. I think that's probably the next slide up there, Harold, somewhere. And then the state also made some payment in lieu of tax payments to jurisdictions that had over 6% state land. And a lot of people, well, since then nobody even knew that the state was doing that. And last session, the legislature repealed the sections of law that even talked about state PILT payments. But those are also included in there. Daniels County, for example, is 22% state land, because when they created the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, they moved all the state sections out of that area and they put them all up in Daniels County. And so if you look at a map of Daniels County, there's a lot of blue sections up there. And so it really impacted their tax base, and so the state always put a modest amount of money back in there to help them out with that. That was also rolled up in this entitlement share. The thing that legislators, and hopefully you will remember and impart this to your other folks, is that money was always county money. The state collected it. It was always county or city money, the gaming, the alcohol, motor vehicles. But when we did this, we rolled it all into the state treasurer under the understanding it would go back. Now that there's a mindset amongst a significant number of legislators that this is all state money. Never was. It's just to simplify the process, you had to do that. And here's where the major simplification was in motor vehicles. You talked a little bit in the last session about non-levy revenue or non-tax revenue and levy revenue. Motor vehicles were basically non-levy revenue. They were, if you collected $100 on a license for a car, the state got a share, whatever share of the 95 mills was of the total mills in that county, where the state got that share. The county got whatever its share was, the school got its share, the miscellaneous district. It was all divided up. And then there were all these fees, 25 cents for weeds and 50 cents for trails and all this. And the county treasurer had to sort that all out and send it to the right place. And then it would some of it get to the state, and then the state would have to send some of it back because of how the state distribution worked. So you had this money flowing around, and it created problems and accountability and accuracy and all kinds of things. And so in the end, what we basically did was said, all of it comes to Helena. You don't count cars. You don't do nothing. You just collect it, send it in. We'll set a base for what you had in 2001 with some growth on it, send it back to you.
If I might, handouts that Leanne just handed out, the bottom one is the revenue matrix. This is for Stillwater County. Every county and municipality did one of these. I have all of the county ones I talked about, the municipal ones. But you can see the headings across the various columns that represents all of the various revenues that were aggregated together to create the base amount. This is only part of the picture. This is just the specific revenues that are enumerated here, but this data was collected from every county in May of 2001.
Okay, so that's the basis of the whole process. You had these huge reimbursements for business equipment that you wanted to get into a system so that they were big enough that the legislature started pulling back money, that you had significant tax impacts at the local level, and so the political will to do that, would not be as great. And then you had this whole simplification process, which just made it easier for everyone to handle and deal with money. And that you add those two together, now you're talking real money. You're talking $150 million, $200 million or something like that. And so it's a big number for the appropriators to look at, but most of the appropriators never sit on policy committees, so they don't really see the other side of that. So after this whole process went, then the county still collected the motor vehicle money, and they collected the district court fees, but they just sent all that money to the state, and then the state sent it back based on a formula that, as Harold was talking about, was basically set up in 2000, 2001 in that time period, and still goes on today. I mean, this thing is almost held together for 20 years now without a lot of real severe impacts on the local governments. As I said, there's been some pretty significant changes in the way the school money flows, and there will be more, but we're not here. That's a different committee, and they'll hopefully see that eventually. And then the state still collected all those sources of revenue, and they sent those back out. So you just had this big entitlement distribution system. The next slide just goes back and revisits, I think, what the components are, and a lot of people, well, I would guess hardly anybody in the building now knows what the components are or were. As evidenced by last session, the elimination of the statute dealing with PILT, and then when the school block grants were, some of the school block grants were taken up, folks were really having a hard time understanding why it impacted certain districts as much as it did, and it was mainly because of things like that there were pieces of the puzzle that nobody recalled or knew about, and so when you started rearranging the puzzle, you didn't know all the pieces that you were affecting when you did that. The other big changes, though, have happened once more there. So a whole lot of other things happened in the beginning of this process and subsequently that affected who provided what services. And when the state took over services, then they went into the entitlement shares, and this mainly affected counties, and made what they thought were the appropriate adjustments at that time. You'll hear all kinds of different versions of reality of how that all came out, but you know, people were doing the best they could with what they had. And I think probably Harold could probably talk more about a lot of these changes than I will, because most of them did affect counties.
Yeah, the two big ones that affected counties were the state assumption of district courts. Now recall that this legislation was passed in 2001. It was a separate bill, the assumption of district courts. But what was done is the actual district court cost data was collected from counties out of their accounting system. And then the separate legislation, also the state assumed the responsibility for the maintenance of paved secondary highways. That interestingly came at the request of the Department of Transportation. And what that allowed is them to better use their funds, the funds that they have available, because what was happening is each county was receiving this allocation that they'd have to build it up until they had enough money to actually do a project. And so there was a very large pot of money that was sitting there allocated but couldn't be used because a county hadn't saved enough to be able to do a project that they wanted. So that money was retained at the state and was then subsequently used for projects that could be literally boots on the ground and done immediately. Then also the other major component was that the state assumed the responsibility for welfare, and I discussed that earlier. But in this handout, the one that's got a little bit of color on it across the top, horizontal, and I hope you've all got really good bifocals and have a sweet spot that you can read these numbers. I don't expect you to read the numbers. I just want to give this to you to show that each year the entitlement share growth has been accounted for And then in 2007, the other major change was with the state assumption of public defenders. And there isn't anybody, I think, more cognizant of how those costs have just exploded since the state assumed that. But any notion that counties did not accurately report their district court costs from the prior year just simply is without basis. The vast majority of those costs were actually audited from for the larger counties by the Legislative Audit Division, and that accounted for the majority of the dollars. And in the other counties, they had contracts with private attorneys to do public defender work, and so those costs were easily extracted from the county's accounting system. So those are the major changes, and you can just simply see the evolution of that in the subsequent slide here. Then there was additions made to the entitlement share as the legislature made policy decisions to reduce the rates for business equipment. What happens, either a reimbursement is made or it becomes a tax shift to other taxpayers, where local governments are allowed to levy the same dollar amount they did the prior year. So when the tax rate of any class of property is reduced, it's going to shift the tax burden to others. And so the entitlement share is working as intended, as this place, this fund, this mechanism where adjustments can be made, both pluses and minuses, to reflect policy changes made by the legislature. And so the entitlement share program is working just exactly as intended, in my opinion anyway.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I would echo that. In fact, that's one of my notes. It's working as intended. The concern, of course, is then how policy changes get made and what effect that would have on us. I will say I argued over the name state entitlement because of that perception. Revenue sharing was taken, but I think that it's important that this was our revenue. This was revenues that we already had, and we agreed to put them in the pail and have it distributed. And so you might be asking yourselves, why would we agree to that? In a large part, it was because of the partnership, that agreement, that we will put this in. This will be put into policy legislatively and therefore can't be changed easily, right? And that we will continue this partnership working together. It also provided cities and counties with stable cash flow. If you look at the revenues that were going into their gaming, which was increasing at that time, the video gaming machines were tied to liquor taxes and or liquor licenses. And with the liquor licenses, they were now able to have 20 machines. That wasn't anything that we, at a city level, controlled as far as how many machines and the growth of gaming at that time. But the gambling revenue, the taxes were distributed to the cities, collected by the state, distributed to the cities. And in some entities, gambling revenue was increasing. We had some smaller entities where their gaming tax might outpace their property tax and their other revenue sources. There was a negative public perception that cities and counties, to a lesser extent, but that cities encouraged gambling, right, to grow our general funds. But that was just perception, but we know how to deal with perception, right? It becomes a reality. So with the gaming tax bundled into here and the simplification of the vehicle tax revenue that went back and forth, we tracked a dollar through 4 different hands, right, when it was going back and forth. So I know I said it earlier, but we really did simplify revenue streams with let's put the money in the pail and divvy it up. But it did provide stable cash flow. These quarterly payments allow cities and counties wanting to monitor our cash flow. And as an example, my city has a 20% cash reserve in the general fund. The quarterly payments that we get from the entitlement program allows us to not have to carry a larger cash reserve in between the tax collections. The other revenues that got bundled in here, you got vehicle tax revenue distributed by the county on the mill levy. That came monthly. There's ebbs and flows with that. The bank tax came, I think, twice a year. And if you had state PILT, that might have been an annual payment. But these payments were kind of all over the board. And obviously you see it even in quarterly. Sometimes gaming is up, sometimes it's down. So the risk that we took as the local government was we're going to put the money in the pail and we're going to trust that it comes back to us. And particularly with that growth factor, that as we recognized growth and we negotiated and debated over an economic indicator, but that stood the test of time for 10 years before the legislature came back and said, hey, we need to look at this indicator that we're using for the growth. And I didn't bring a whole bunch of numbers today, which these two will find ironic because I'm a numbers person. But the Department of Revenue is currently updating the EntitlementShare payment and block grant payment summary and history. And hopefully at the next meeting, we can look a little bit more at the numbers because the program really is working as it's intended to work at this time.
I just wanted to talk briefly about the growth factor. So we had all these sources of revenue going into the pot and coming back out. The entitlement or the reimbursement money was just that. It was whatever it was. But you had gaming. Cities and counties and schools all had different revenue sources, and so they had different growth potentials. A lot of the gaming is in cities. Counties have a little bit of gaming. Motor vehicles were distributed according to what your revenues or your mill levies were. So, the state historically got a fifth of them. The school district got 2/5, the county got a fifth, and the city got a fifth, roughly. The state had pretty much given away all its motor vehicle money in the late 90s because every time the legislature met, they changed the motor vehicle fees and taxes, and rather than do a reimbursement at that time, they just said, well, we'll let the schools have a portion of our share, or we'll just not take our proportion, and what's left will be distributed by a different proportion amongst those folks that get it. So the state was pretty much out of the vehicle revenue stream, other than they were always dabbling in how much it was, what they were going to be, which then affected everybody else. They haven't done that since this program went in, because now every time you do it, it comes out of the state treasury. It doesn't come out of somebody else's pocket. So a lot of that's stopped a lot of the messing around in the property tax system, because the state then felt obligated to reimburse, and so it cost them money to do something that might be politically popular. So it changed some of that. Anyway, so the growth factors, when we originally put it together, the cities had a growth factor, the counties had a growth factor, the schools had a growth factor. They were all different, but they had an inflator on them. That subsequently got changed before the bill got out of the session, and the growth factors were then more unified. And then, of course, what's happened in the last couple sessions, people are saying, well, how can you have this huge growth factor on this entitlement share when all local governments get is half the rate of inflation on their property taxes? Why should the growth be any greater than that? Well, it should be greater than that because it's driven by vehicle money and gaming money and alcohol money that the state is now getting. And if the growth factor is reduced, then the state gets to keep that excess growth in its treasury. That's really what that's about. And so people, when someone gets up and says, well, this is a sweet deal for local governments because they're getting a growth factor greater than half the rate of inflation, well, that's because the revenue streams that are in here grow at generally a rate greater than half the inflation. And if you don't give that back, it just generates property taxes at the local level and revenue in the state treasury that probably wasn't anticipated. So something to think about on that. That's kind of pretty much the whole gist of the entitlement program as we know it today, why it came about and what its purposes were, and I think there's 2 or 3 people in the legislature that were here in 2001 when this was adopted. And they probably weren't fans of it. But so it's just important that anytime someone comes up with a great idea to start tinkering with this program, that
Well, I can imagine with the acoustics of this room and that big speaker that's installed up.
there's a relatively easy job. You don't provide services to a lot of people. And if you think about that, that's true. You know, services are provided by schools and cities and counties to the vast majority of the population of Montana. The services the legislature is particularly tasked with providing are incarceration, welfare, and those, and a little bit of contribution to some contribution to education. But you as a legislature, the policy decisions you make generally aren't providing services to the average citizen. Those are all done at the local level with a pretty limited tax base, and so as you make decisions about what hard decisions about spending at the state level, the easy decision is let the locals worry about picking up the cost and keep the money in Helen. And I've always tried to oppose that, and I will continue to do that. But just hopefully you keep that thought in mind as you move through your trials and tribulations.
Any questions from the committee? Representative Fern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for any willing one answer. It's a kind of a two-part question. One would be for this to pull this off back. Did the subsequent biennium have to project good years ahead to be able to afford to do it? That's number one. And two would be what, roughly speaking, what's the percentage of entitlement going back to cities versus their total budget? Is there a general average percentage?
Let me try the first one. No, the legislature didn't have to cook the books to make this work. The money was already in the bank. You knew how much you were collecting on each of these tax sources. You were only giving back what you were collecting. The reimbursement for property tax cuts was a known number. It was in the budget in 1999 to do that, and just maintained that. So the added cost to the state was just the growth issues, and again, most of those growth revenues were now flowing into the state, so that money came anyway if you met your growth estimates. So it was really just a bookkeeping process that the state took the money, collected it, and sent it back out, as opposed to having some of these 3 or 4 time transfers to make things work. Motor vehicles, for example, if you go into the statute now, it used to be there's 25 cents for this, 25 cents for that, and the treasurer had to sort that out. That went to, of the total vehicle revenue, 0.015% goes to this program. That's the way the law works now. It sometimes gets changed because when people draft bills to create a new fee on vehicles, they don't tie back into that, and then you're back trying to figure out how much 25 cents on however many vehicles licensed are. But the section about percentage, Susan can talk to, or maybe even Tim Burton.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Fern, that's an interesting question. Because of how the data is presented, there isn't a specific percentage of those revenues. I will say that the revenues that were collected that base year, cities were over $40 million with the specific revenues that were bundled in. and currently with growth, they're about 65 million. It is, so now that we, at the state level, the state tracks those individual sources, the vehicle taxes, video gaming, the liquor license, and then, of course, and then district court assumption. I know, and I mentioned it earlier, that the percentage of my general fund budget that's funded by the state entitlement is 24%. How that would have related to not bundling that revenue back in 2001, how much more gaming or vehicle license or liquor would be hard to predict, but they do track those revenues, and actually I'm looking forward to getting the updated Department of Revenue spreadsheet so that that can be provided to this committee as well.
Follow up?
So when you did 12.6, 12.6, 6.3, some of it was phased. I mean, that was a reduction in what the state would see. I don't know if you said 75 million. So you're saying that there was there was enough growth to make up for that, to be able to redistribute it?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Fern, no, that's really not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, in fact, the cost of the state was greater than that because the state also lost its 95 mil revenue on those same things. So, I mean, what we're talking about in the reimbursement is about 80% of the total cost, because that's generally the proportion. At that time, 500 mills and the state was collecting 100 of them. Now it's 800 mills and the state's collecting 100 of them. But that was just a cost the legislature decided that was good policy to try to, for several reasons, try to change the economic thing. For example, electrical generation was reduced from 12 to 6%. Well, at that time was the whole deregulation discussion going on, that there would be a national effort to deregulate the electrical system, that it might be that whatever came out of Washington is what you were stuck with. There was a lot of impetus in Montana to move the generators into private ownership for various reasons, not all to do with deregulation. Telecom the same way. If you wanted to get investment in telecommunications into Montana, could you get it at a 12% tax rate when everyone around you was at something else? So there were just a lot of political policy decisions made about what our tax rate should be, and knowing that there would be an impact, the state would absorb those impacts and not push them down to basically the homeowners and the businessmen that were left in the tax base.
Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is also to anyone who wants to reflect on it, but it was a handshake, and I don't know if it anticipated the effect over time of term limits. And so I'm wondering if you have deep regrets about this, or if it is holding up pretty well for you.
Well, I can't speak for anyone else but myself, but I have absolutely no regrets. I think it was the right thing to do then, and it's the right thing today. I hate to disappoint Robert, but I actually didn't make a copy of some of the flow charts of before and after, because if you can just imagine a bowl full of spaghetti, that's what a lot of the flow charts worked about revenues that were collected. And one of the issues with that is when you consider every time there's a transaction, there's possible error. So eliminating, dramatically reducing the number of data entry points and money exchanges helps reduce the possibility of error. So I think we've got a lot better accounting, a lot more accurate accounting than we have. I'm asked about that. Holy cow! Local governments, were you crazy putting all your money and all your eggs in one basket and leaving it to the legislature? But in response, I point out, hey, the legislature could have went in and just clipped those individual revenues off one at a time too. I mean, we're totally at the whim of the legislature, and if you have like the state PILT payment, that never was, well, I shouldn't say never, but historically was not being funded at the calculated formula-driven amount. It was very typically around 40% appropriated. So the legislature could have gone in and just simply eliminated the state pill payment, and there were it was a minority number of counties that were receiving that, and likewise for some of the other ones. So it's quite easy to pick off a minority constituency or a minority number. So yeah, there certainly was some risk, and that's the one thing that I regret about retiring is, hey, here's where the historical knowledge is going to be now, and that being able to convey that to new legislators, because you are exactly on point with new legislators come in. They just see a large expenditure of money and they go, well, we need to do something about that. And so, but it is one thing that's easy to rally local governments around. I will say that they will come when the entitlement share is threatened, because it really was a commitment and between local governments and the legislature at the time.
I would just add that handshake was very important. I concur with Harold. I don't have any regrets, but every time there's a bill that affects the entitlement, the three of us are called to Helena and to remind folks that this is what you promised and this is what we did. Term limits and retirements have not been kind to this program, and it does seem like an easy question for particularly new legislators. Why is this 120 million or 150 million? Why are we distributing this money? That'd be a pretty easy budget cut. But there was that handshake and that promise, but that's also why we fought so hard to create this committee, because that was one of the other recommendations that didn't go into place, was continuing that work and continuing this partnership. So I'm much more comfortable with the entitlement program, even with that name, if with this committee, the ability to work together and to come and answer questions and educate. We're here to serve.
Oh, I think I pretty much gave my comments a couple minutes ago about what I think about it.
Representative Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for all three of you. You're very accurate with your comments about freshmen coming in and not understanding this. I've learned a tremendous amount here this morning, and I'm on appropriations. Have you ever considered doing this presentation to appropriations, so we can understand better?
Never been asked. But it'd probably be worthwhile in the early education process of both the finance and or even in the joint local, Section A or whatever, it'd be, because it is a Department of Revenue appropriation. The money goes to DOR and they distribute it. So, yeah, it'd be good to do it somewhere where people, where it's not in the heat of just dealing with a particular bill.
Follow up then, please, Mr. Chairman. Okay, we do have a couple of days at the beginning of the appropriations meetings when we really don't have a whole lot going on other than training. And I would think this would be something that, I realize that Department of Revenue is a big part of it, but we vote on these things. And if we're voting in the blind, that's not good for anybody. So maybe consider this an invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative. A lot of it is in how it's presented, too. I mean, the Department of Revenue basically went through this whole exercise with the Revenue and Transportation Committee about 2 years ago, and by the time they got done, people's eyes were rolled back and they didn't really know what the situation was. So it depends on how deep you want to dig into it. If you want to just know this high level stuff, or if you want to know this third tier stuff.
One more comment there, but okay. From my perspective, the history would be important, because I think we all recognize we lose that when we're termed out after 8 years.
Representative Fern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess once again, this is for any willing member. Does 15, 10, 420, when it enshrines a growth rate cap, does that include entitlement shares, or is that looked at differently?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Representative Fern, no, there's no relationship in 1510 420. The entitlement share is set forth in 15.1 121, a totally different area of law. So there is no connection. And if you might, Representative Holman, I have a copy of the handout that I know I've presented to Revenue and Transportation over the years many times, and I think also finance, legislative finance during an interim. But during a session, no, we try to keep comments to 2 to 3, maybe 5 minutes at the most during a hearing on a bill. So it really is difficult to delve into a whole lot of detail like we've been able to do today, which makes a committee like this very valuable. But I think a wonderful suggestion for Robert and Susan.
Mr. Chairman, part of when the interim committees were reorganized about some time ago, I can't even remember when, one of the goals was to have finance and appropriations people sitting on the policy interim committees, in the hopes that some of this information would flow back into that. It's more important in the House than in the Senate, because senators both serve on finance and serve on policy committees. But in the House, if you're on approps, you don't see the policy committees. And the thought was that if you could get some of the approps people sitting on the policy interim committees, that then they would get some of that knowledge that everybody else had, so that when you got into these discussions at the committee level in the legislature, you'd have that knowledge. And also then, because you dealt with the agency budgets, when the agency came in front of this committee and said we're doing A, B, and C, and then they came to you and said we're doing D, E, and F, you could say, what's with that?
Interesting. Representative Tribus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and whoever wants to field this. I am looking at this sheet that we got in the cumulative percent increase from my home county of Cascade County, and just noticing that it seems to have a really high, especially among really high cumulative percent increase, especially compared to other counties that contain a Class 1 city. And so just for a tangible example for myself, so I'll kind of have something to kind of tie this to in memory, what seems to be the trend there? Why did that happen? It seems like early on we were receiving lower amounts of entitlement share relative to other Class 1 areas. Then it was stagnant for a while, and then it saw some growth. So it seems to be an outlier. So what's kind of the trend that drives that cumulative percent increase?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Representative Tribus, Cascade County is a county that had very high district court and welfare cost. And so I can get you the revenue matrix for Cascade County, and it will show what went into the base. But from that base, the county's costs for district court and welfare were deducted, and it virtually wiped out Cascade County. So that's why they have a very low base amount or entitlement share dollar amount. The reason for the growth is the growth is split on two factors. And one is based on population, and I just went brain dead. Robert, can you help me? But it relates to the 50% of the growth being related to population and 50% being related to the prior year payment. It used to be each jurisdiction's base contribution, and then that was changed, and so it's just how the interaction of those two factors go. There is no connection whatsoever to similar counties or anything like that, because it's 100% based upon real numbers to start with.
Mr. Chairman and Representative, I would add that counties had a different component to this whole program. And counties were able to keep the mills that they had for their poor funds and district court. And they have kept those. They used to call it the entitlement levy, but most of them have now rolled it up into their overall levy. So Cascade County would have had seven mills?
9, I think.
Nine mills that they have had at their disposal to use and grow for whatever purposes they needed.
One other point that I think is really, really important that is easy to be overlooked is, we'll say that a jurisdiction's contribution to district court was $200,000, and when district court was assumed, those are, because those dollars are reduced from the entitlement share, those dollars are not growing. So you can indirectly say that the county's $200,000 contribution to district court actually continues to grow because the entitlement share deduction is there. And so, we could assume that the county's revenues would have continued. Those revenues that it was deducted from would have continued to grow, that are no longer county revenues. And I know that didn't make a lick of sense, but it does to me.
I'll go back and watch the recording and
Yeah.
study that for a while.
Any additional comments or questions from the committee? Folks, thank you very much for the history lesson. It is an eye-opener.